Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the Adams Brothers podcast. We are here this evening here with Mr. Samuel Sinyangwe, and he is the owner of Mapping Police Violence, and that is what he does is track police shootings all across America, and we're here to ask him some questions today. Hello, Samuel, and welcome to the Adams Brothers podcast.
How's it going? It's good to be here.
Good to have you here.
Good to have you here. Good to have you here. So let's get into it here. You're the owner of Mapping Police Violence. Tell us a little bit about Mapping Police Violence.
So, Mapping Police Violence is a national database of cases in which people have been killed by the police. I started the project really in the context of the Ferguson uprising in 2014 and early 2015. At that time, as the nation really became focused on this issue of police violence and racism in the context of policing. In those early days and weeks and months, and now it's been 7 or 8 years since the Ferguson uprising. It became clear very early on in that national conversation that there was very little data being provided by the government to help us understand this issue. So, the federal government can tell you how much rainfall there was in rural Oklahoma going back 100 years, but they can't tell you how many people were killed by the police this year or last year or the year before that. They simply just do not have a data collection system that is proven capable of collecting this information systematically and reliably across the country, or maybe they just simply don't care enough to collect that information. Either way, we needed that information to understand how widespread this crisis is. We've seen video after video after video of Black people being killed by the police over the past many years now. But the data that my organization has compiled has really shown how widespread this issue is. So what we found was that there are about 1,100 people killed by police every year in this country. And so that's about 3 people every single day. And we also found is that for every person killed by police, there are between 1 and 2 people who are shot by police and survive, and an estimated 55,000 people a year who are hospitalized due to injuries caused by police. So this is a really widespread issue. This is all across the country. People are killed by police in every single state. And what we know, given the data, is how Black communities are disproportionately impacted by this violence. So, we've been in this conversation now for many years. And one side of this conversation has been really pushing back against narratives that have tried to erase or justify police violence against Black people. So, early on, there was an attempt by, folks who didn't think that this was even a problem or that there was a crisis to say, actually, this is very rare. It's not happening that often. Police are not being discriminatory. Police are not more likely to kill Black people than white people. Well, it turns out, like when we look at the data, Black people are about 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people nationwide, more likely to be unarmed. So that's what the data has shown. And again, we've been collecting this now for about 7 years. And in that time, what we've actually learned is that despite all of the conversation, despite all of the proclamations by elected officials that they're doing something about this, the issue has not gone away. In fact, more people have been killed by police so far this year than at any other year on record. So we have data going back a decade. And at no other point in that decade have more people been killed by the police than have been killed so far this year. So far, we have 727 people we've tracked who've been killed by police through August 11th of this year. So again, this is an ongoing issue, an ongoing crisis, something that is not getting better, and something that we ought to continue talking about and, more importantly, really deal with.
Right. And is it true that white people are killed more by the police than Black people?
No. So essentially, we look at the demographics nationwide. White people are about 62% of the country, and when we look at police killings, that is not the case. White people are closer to between 45 and 55% of those killed by the police. So when we just look at the demographics of the country, and we look at the demographics of who's killed by police. You have a situation where, again, white people are 62% of the population, about half of those killed by police, so underrepresented relative to their proportion in the population. Whereas for Black people, we're about 13% of the population, and about 28% of those killed by the police. So wildly overrepresented relative to the population. What that means is when you break that down at the individual level, the average Black person faces a 3 times higher risk of being killed by the police than the average white person. So that's how the data breaks down. I mean, there have been attempts by people to try to say, well, doesn't that mean the police kill more white people than Black people? I mean, technically, there are more white people killed by the police in absolute numbers because there are more white people in America. But again, when we look at the actual disparities and the relative risk of being killed, it's much higher if you're Black in America.
Right. And how do you collect your data? Is it through the FBI or the Department of Justice? I mean, you don't have to go down into really like details and let us, but just how do you collect your data?
So it's not through the FBI or the Department of Justice,
right.
Because the federal government does not collect reliable data on this issue. So right. I mean, the FBI announced that they created a use of force data collection program. This was announced all the way back in 2016, and fast forward to today, that program has been operational for about 3 years, and they have not shared any data from that program yet. So you only know, using the information collected by that program, you can't tell how many people were killed by police in your city, how many people your local sheriff's department may have killed in a previous year. Any of that information is all hidden. And not only that, but that program has been so underreported too. So only about half the nation's law enforcement agencies even report data to that program, which means that it might even get shut down because it just doesn't have the level of participation that the Office of Management and Budget requires a data collection program to have to even stay operational. So that's the federal program. That's the data the FBI has. We can't get any of that. They don't share it publicly. So to get the information without that, what we have to do is collect it from a variety of different sources. So one, the primary source really is local media reports. So when somebody is killed by police, according to the best research evidence that has come out to date, about 90 to 95% of the time that somebody is killed by the police, it's reported somewhere in local media. The challenge is compiling, finding all those different articles, and then taking the information in those articles and translating that into a database. So I have a system of Google alerts. So whenever an article is published that has, let's say, a keyword like officer involved shooting, police shooting, in custody death, a variety of other terms, that's flagged. I get an alert, and then working with my team, we input the information from that article, and it gets included in the database. So that's one major source.
Okay.
The other source is actually getting the information directly from law enforcement agencies through public records requests. So submitting requests to individual police departments to get access to all of the data they have on police shootings by their agency. And then also in some states now, they've started their own statewide use of force data collection programs that are actually useful and public, not like the federal one. So California has a police shootings database up and running. Texas has one. Georgia has one. Colorado has one. New York just started one. So in some of the largest states in the country, they're starting to build their own systems that we're able to leverage as well. So all of those different sources come together. We pull them together, make sense of them, fill in the gaps in the details. So, the names of the officers, whether the person was reportedly armed or unarmed, where the incident happened, whether there was mental health issues involved, what the incident was reportedly, initiated for. So was it a traffic stop? Was it, drug enforcement or what have you? So all of that is the work that we do. And then once that information is entered and coded, then we can start making sense of what's going on across the country. And that's really where so much of the meaning making happens, where we start to understand, the breadth and depth of police violence across the country. When we start to understand how different communities are impacted, we start to understand that the majority of these cases started off with either a traffic stop, a mental health crisis, or a low-level nonviolent issue. So that's sort of the process.
Do you think the police should be trained in mental health crisis, or do you think that they should like have a mental health counselor come along with them, someone that's really trained to deal with someone who's having a mental health crisis? Because if I can remember correctly, there was a young lady. I believe her name was Brianna Greer up in Georgia. She was
Yep.
well, she wasn't killed, but she was killed in police custody. And but she was having a mental health crisis. And to me, I just think that they should have someone that should go along with them, who's really trained to deal with them, other than just, maybe pulling out a gun and shooting them sometime or taking them off to jail. That's really not solving the problem. You need to get them some help, So I just think, that they need to have someone that's trained to deal with someone that's having a mental breakdown.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, so when we look at what's happening nationwide, the average police recruit, like to become a police officer, you get 58 hours of firearms training and 8 hours of crisis intervention training. So that's
Right.
training in how to engage in crises, mental health crises.
Right.
So I mean, that's obviously not setting anybody up to deal effectively with these situations in ways that prevent people from being harmed further. Now, that's sort of the status quo, but there are some places that are starting to experiment with new approaches to this, and those approaches are starting to share some early results, and the results look promising.
Right.
So, you look at what's happening in Denver with the STAR program, where now there have been several thousand 911 calls that they've diverted and sent a mental health provider instead of the police to the call. And in across thousands of calls, really since 2020 when they started the program, they've never had to send in a police officer for backup. They never had to call the police for backup. Those mental health clinicians were effective in de-escalating the situation, resolving the situation, meeting that person's needs who was having the crisis without needing the police in every single case. So that shows that we don't need to be sending the police to these calls.
That's
that
right.
There is a alternative pathway that not only could work, it is already working in places like Denver. And they're starting to scale that model in other places too. So you have Portland with the street response teams. You have San Francisco where they have their own program that's now being piloted. New York has the Be Heard program. So this is starting to happen in some of the largest cities in the country, but it really needs to be much more widespread than that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Wayne?
So Samuel, back in 2014 with the Michael Brown case in Ferguson, Missouri, in your data collecting, what did you find was most problematic while you were there in Ferguson, Missouri back in 2014 in the Michael Brown case with Officer Darren Wilson?
So what I'll say is, and going back to 2014, this was really like the beginning of a national conversation around police violence, racism in policing. I think when I think back to 2014 and 2015 and in that early conversation, at that time, I was really focused on, but before getting into this work, before Ferguson, my work was really focused on school to prison pipeline issues. So, I was working at a nonprofit in Oakland, a research organization, and I was collecting and analyzing data having to do with disproportionate suspensions, referrals to law enforcement, arrests at school for Black kids, and trying to develop solutions to stop that from happening, remove the police from schools. And at that time, I remember so much of the early national conversation in the wake of Ferguson was focused on convincing the nation that this was a crisis, a systemic issue. Because what we would hear back from the police is that this is an isolated incident, that this was maybe Mike Brown was an isolated incident, or Tamir Rice was an isolated incident, or Walter Scott was an isolated incident, and it'd be video after video after video, and they would come up with some sort of explanation why either the officers didn't do anything wrong in that case, or maybe they did something wrong, but if we just removed or disciplined those officers in that case, these 1, 2, 3, or 4 officers, and removed them, somehow we would have cured the problem. And I think now, fast forward to today, I think it's very clear that that is insufficient, right? That the problem is not a problem of a handful of police officers who are rogue or bad apples or whatever they're called. The problem is deeply systemic, that this is happening at a scale all across the country that is much bigger than any 1, 2, or 3 officers, or even 1, 2, or 3 police departments, or even 1, 2, or 3 states. Like, this is, police are killing people in all 50 states every single year. They're killing 1,100 people every single year like clockwork. And in addition to that, Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed every single year like clockwork, and more likely to be unarmed every single year. I mean, we have a decade of data, and every single year that's the case. So it takes a lot more than a handful of officers or a handful of police departments to reproduce those outcomes every single year all across the country like clockwork. So this is deeply systemic. It's a system that is designed to produce a certain outcome that it hits those targets almost every single year. So that's what we're dealing with. I think that the data has been instrumental in helping me understand that, helping me unpack that and demonstrate that. And I think that that's been an important sort of evolution in my own sort of personal development and thinking. And I also think as a country, we're sort of in a different place now than we were then. Thinking differently about, it's the calls for change are much bigger than, indict this one officer, arrest this one officer, fire this one officer. Now we're really talking about wholesale transformation of the system. And I think that's the right thing to do.
Yeah, like here in Florida, I'm in my 50s, so I can go back and I can remember back in the late 70s when we had Arthur McDuffie here in Miami, the McDuffie riots. I'm old enough to remember that. And shortly after that, there was a guy named in 1982 named Neville Johnson. He was in an arcade, and they say he had a gun in his pocket. Police came, he went around real quick. Police shot him in the head. Shortly after that, we had I think he was Colombian or Brazilian officer, Richard Lozano, I believe his name was.
William
Lozano. I'm sorry. And
Miami Police Department.
He shot 2 motorcyclists. I was a motorcyclist, Blanchard, and he shot him. Shot. Say they tried to hit him, and he shot one of them in the back of the head. The guy crashed, killed both of them. But it took all of those uprisings, and the police here in Florida still have not learned anything here. I mean, it's like they haven't learned anything here, and especially here. I'm here in Broward County, Florida, near Fort Lauderdale, and we don't really see a lot of police brutality. Not a lot, but we do see it. But it's like they don't learn anything. And my question to you actually was, what kind of resistance, Samuel, do you meet when you get when you meet with the policymakers in these different cities?
So I think that a lot of the resistance is based on a set of narratives and assumptions that are just simply untrue, right? And so I think about this in the context of in many different issues. Even thinking separately from police violence, there are a set of narratives that either enable or obstruct progress from being made politically. So when we talk about gun violence, for example, and mass shootings or school shootings, there's this narrative around the good guy with the gun, right? This idea that, if we just had more good guys with the gun, if we made it even easier for people to get guns, and we had even more people with AR-15s, that somehow like that person would be on the scene, would prevent something from happening, and that's the way to keep us safe. That's like the narrative. Now, like all the research shows that's wrong, right? Like all the research is saying more guns, larger capacity clips, more AR-15s mean more people are getting shot. Like that's what it means. But that research almost doesn't even matter, because the narrative of the good guy with the gun has so much power in of itself that it blocks the actual science from making the progress, or from being more widely understood and resulting in the type of policy change that people deserve. So in policing, there's a similar narrative. And it's similarly wrong. And that narrative is this idea that that police are using deadly force at such high rates, particularly in Black and brown communities, and the narrative asserts that is because There are violent individuals that police are encountering who are a danger to other people or to officers, that officers need to defend themselves and others from harm by using deadly force. That's the narrative, right? This idea that like officers are just encountering violent people who are threatening, endangering their lives, endangering other people's lives, and officers have to keep people safe. That's like the narrative. Now, it's not true, right? When we look at the actual data, it's not true. When we look at the data, what it shows is that the majority of cases in which people are killed by police start off from a nonviolent, low-level issue or an issue in which no crime was alleged. Fewer than 1 in 3 cases start with a reported violent crime. So that's number one. Number two, what we see is that even when we look at communities with similar crime rates, you have vastly different levels of police violence. So, you have places that have very high levels of crime and relatively low levels of police shootings. And you have the opposite of that. So I'll give you an example, Orlando, Florida, right? Orlando, Florida has one of the highest rates of killings by the police in the United States of America.
Right.
Now, it's not the most violent city in the country, right? It is not. And yet, like, it has a very high rate of police violence. Spokane, Washington, similarly. Meanwhile, you have places like Newark, which have much higher crime rates, much lower rates of police shootings. So something else is explaining why the police in Newark somehow are able to respond to these types of issues that police say are so difficult without killing people in a way that officers in Orlando aren't even responding to those types of challenges and are still killing people. So something else is explaining officer behavior that doesn't have to do with crime or encountering particular types of individuals or particular neighborhoods. Those are all distractions. Those are all excuses for police behavior that can actually be addressed directly. So part of the work is trying to dismantle those narratives, use data to directly challenge those narratives. So, I said Orlando, Florida. A couple of years ago, I met with the Orlando police chief, Orlando Rolon. I think he might not be a police chief anymore. I'm not sure. I have to double check.
I think he is. I think he is after this other guy. I forget his name, but he retired a few years ago, and then he took over. This guy you're talking about now.
Yep. So so met with the Orlando police chief, showed this data, right? Showed, okay, here's the chart, 100 largest cities in the country. Orlando is like right up at the top of the chart, one of the highest rates of killings by the police. And the police chief goes, well, it might appear that way, but actually, we can't be compared to other cities because Orlando has an unusual number of tourists. We have so many tourists, and they're always on Orange Avenue on Friday and Saturday nights at bars and causing a lot of trouble. And so our officers are dealing with a uniquely challenging situation. That's why they're using more force, because they're encountering more rowdy individuals in other cities. That was literally the argument that like the city, that was like the city's argument, right? Like that's their explanation.
Those are everywhere. Bars and hangouts are everywhere across the country.
So this is why this is why you got to have the data, right? Because then I literally have a chart right here. So I look back at the chart and say, okay, here's New Orleans and here is Las Vegas, way down below Orlando in terms of the rate of killings by the police. So you mean to tell me that your officers in Orlando, Florida, in Orange Avenue, right? Like I grew up there. It's not that wild, right? Like it's not that wild.
Right.
Your officers responding to this street are encountering a more challenging environment than the police at Bourbon Street or the Las Vegas Strip. And the police chief looks at the data. He looks at me like he can tell like something's going on. And he's like, okay, you might be onto something. Right. So without that, like literally without that chart, like we would be talking back and forth the whole time. Because what was I gonna say that would, like what was I gonna say about his officers? He's the police, he could always say what he's gonna say, and it's hard to chat, like it's my word against his. But with the data, like it allows for that conversation to move past those narratives that have blocked the change from happening and to move us into a solutions conversation where we've actually acknowledged that there's a problem.
Right. Do you think a lot of these police shootings can be avoided by better training?
Well, I think it's going to take a lot more than better training. So I mean, there's been a lot of research that's been done on police training. And in general, it's not promising. There are a couple studies that show that it might reduce use of force, like moderately, but a lot of other studies have shown that it doesn't have an impact. And then we have to think about, like, you know, what's in the training, because there's not one standard training. There are all these different training curricula, different people who are trainers, different quality programs, and very few of them have been rigorously evaluated. So, so it's sort of it costs a lot of money to invest in police training, and there's not a whole lot of proof that it'll make a big difference. So I think that's, you know, obviously, you know, the police ought to be trained. They shouldn't just be getting these 58 hours of firearms training and nothing else. Like, the only thing that they're spending time training is learning how to shoot people. And I think they ought to learn a whole host of other things instead. But I don't think that's going to be, it's going to make a huge difference in the numbers. I think actually, when we look at where we have seen some shifts, and there have been some places that have made progress in reducing police shootings. In fact, some of the largest cities in the country have reduced police shootings about 40% since about 2013 or so, really since the beginning of this conversation. So there has been some progress, particularly in some of the largest cities. And the places that have made the most progress have been places that have reduced the number of arrests that police are making, particularly for low-level nonviolent offenses. So really, they're the places that are creating alternative approaches to mental health issues, to substance use issues, drug possession, to sex work and prostitution, to homelessness and poverty. So instead of arresting people for trespassing or loitering or vagrancy, they're creating alternative approaches to get people services or housing. Those have actually been the places that have seen the largest reductions in police shootings, according to the data. So, I mean, I think that what that indicates is that, you know, we ought to move in that direction. We ought to be creating more and better approaches and responses that are not police-based to some of these issues. And also importantly, when we talk about narrative, you know, there's this narrative that if we stop arresting people and incarcerating people for, you know, drug use and mental health issues and, you know, not having enough money to have a house or a roof over your head, that'll somehow increase crime. And that's like the narrative, or that crime rates are increasing because the police have backed off and stopped arresting people and being aggressive towards people for these things. But it couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, the places that have reduced the aggressive enforcement of low-level issues have actually seen less of an increase in crime than the places that double down on continue to arrest people for those things.
And how important, I'm sorry, how important is it to have more progressive DAs in our cities and across the country?
So I think it's very important because, you know, that story about the places reducing police shootings having reduced arrests for low-level offenses, that's partially a story about progressive DAs. In many of those cities where the arrests for low-level offenses reduced dramatically, they reduced because the DA said they were going to stop prosecuting those cases. So it's places like Baltimore, where, you know, State's Attorney Mosby said, no, we're not going to prosecute low-level offenses. You see arrests for low-level offenses drop dramatically after that decision. Similarly, you had San Francisco under Chesa before he was recalled, that made pretty substantial reductions in arrests, and in other jurisdictions as well, even New York City. So I think, you know, that's a big piece of the system that we should be focusing on, because the DA or state's attorney can actually use their power to discourage the police from making those arrests. And the fewer arrests that police make, the less encounters that they have that could escalate to people getting harmed or even killed.
And as far as, do you really think, Samuel, that a lot of problems are the police unions and their police bill of rights? How problematic do you see in your collection of data that the police unions and their bill of rights, they have these bill of rights where it's almost impossible
qualified immunity
for them to even get fired or terminated or disciplined?
Yep. So it's a huge issue. I mean, the police unions are sort of like how in the broader sort of gun violence space, you got the NRA that blocks anything from happening. The police unions are the NRA in the police reform space. So like anything that you want to move in terms of policy, in terms of transformational change, the police unions are your number one adversary in terms of moving that through. They have substantial institutional power. And it's not just like their political power. Like people think of the police unions as, this group that can mobilize officers to you really make a political statement. So you see what happened to Mayor de Blasio in New York when the police turned their backs on him, and it was really embarrassing for him. He sort of lost control of the department. So the police unions have that power, right, that they can exercise over politicians, but they also have institutional advantages that operate behind the scenes. So a lot of that happens through police union contracts. So every 3 to 4 years in your city or county, they will renegotiate the contract with the local police union. Right. And those contracts actually are policy documents. Those contracts are what determines how and whether police are investigated for misconduct, whether they can be disciplined and what level of discipline can happen, whether they can get their jobs back through appealing those disciplinary decisions, even if they do get fired. In many cases, many cities, because of these contracts, the majority of officers who are fired for misconduct end up being able to get their jobs back through this process. Right. So this whole accountability structure of the police department is really shaped by this contract and by these negotiations with the police union to form that contract. So it's really important, and it happens behind the scenes. These negotiations are behind closed doors. Community members really don't get access to the negotiating table. Cities are going in with their own set of negotiating priorities, which are often not what the community wants. And the police unions are able to basically use and leverage that advantage. They can say, if the negotiations aren't fruitful for them, if the city is demanding a more accountable system, the police union can walk away and keep the original contract in effect until a new one's agreed to. So they have veto power over this whole system through that process. So it's a huge problem, and you do see some places starting to tackle that problem. So in DC, for example, Washington DC, you have they just signed legislation that removes all issues of investigations and discipline of officers from the purview of that negotiation. So it says, we can negotiate over police, salaries or benefits like a normal union would, but we're not going to negotiate over, whether this officer can be fired if they shoot somebody. We're not going to negotiate over, whether they can get their job back after they've already been determined to have committed misconduct. So there's some progress on that. More places should be, moving in that direction so that they can remove the power from the police unions.
What are your thoughts on a nationwide police misconduct database? Do you think it's needed to track these bad officers that, that may kill someone here at this department, and then a year later they get hired at another department, and they go right back and do the same thing, and maybe kill kill more people? So again, what are your thoughts on a nationwide police misconduct database that tracks police misconduct?
So I think it's an important first step, but it's the databases that have been proposed and even in some states implemented so far have been very limited in effectiveness. And the reason for that is they don't track all the things they need to track to really flag the officers that need to be removed. So most of these databases, they wait until an officer has already, done an egregious act, so egregious that they actually get disciplined or fired for it, and then it reports it to the database. But that's missing all of these other incidents that happened before then that the officer probably never got disciplined for. So nationwide, when we look at excessive force complaints, for example, excessive force allegations, only about 1 in every 12 of those allegations results in a finding against the officer, meaning that they were found to have committed misconduct and discipline. So 11 out of the 12 complaints, they're basically just tossed out. Like they don't result in any type of a finding that would then be able to be used against that officer in the future. So these databases will capture that 1 in 12, but they won't get the other 11. And you need that other 11 so you could build these patterns, so you can better understand more holistically, these are all the officers that are at risk of being likely to harm somebody in the future. So that's the kind of information that ought to be in that database, but the existing ones don't include that, in part, again, because the police unions, right? The police unions lobby very hard to say, well, we don't want to have officers unfairly treated, or if an allegation hasn't been substantiated, we can't have unsubstantiated allegations in this database. That's not fair to the officers. So we're going to exclude every allegation that hasn't resulted in a finding against the officer, which is 11 out of the 12 allegations, not because the officer didn't do anything wrong, but because the system is just simply didn't care to hold them accountable for it. So that's the limitation of it, but it's a good start.
Well, that's internal affairs. How can the police department police themselves? I mean, that a lot of it starts with internal affairs.
Yes.
It doesn't get reported the way it's supposed to, and then these cops get a little slap on the hand, and all these suspensions and things that they should get, they don't get them. So it's like I said, it's kind of hard to track this stuff.
And here in Florida, Miami-Dade and Broward County, Samuel, officers are arrested in Miami with Catherine Fernandez-Rundle. She's the state attorney there, and our state attorney in Broward County is a progressive DA named Harold Pryor. Now, he's holding these officers accountable. He's bringing them forward, but when it get to the jury, I think that's where it all stops at. I don't think they're putting enough African-American on the juries. They'll put us on every other civil case, but they don't put enough of us and other minorities on these cases. And it's like every week we see a cop on trial and he's acquitted. I mean, the video is right there where they're throwing kids on the ground, pushing their head on the ground. You see the full video, and they're getting acquitted. And that's where we see here in Broward and Dade County, we see it gets to the judicial system, but somewhere along the line, I don't know if prosecutors are dropping the ball, they're not being aggressive enough in the courtroom, but they leave out of there with a acquittal. And
they end up getting their jobs back too.
Yes, and that's what I see. And also here, the police unions own the state and local representatives in Florida. I mean, I have never seen so many cities and state legislators, Democrat and Republicans, that are so pro-police. They give the police everything they want. So in Florida here, I mean, you already know it's like they back the blue 100%, and they craft laws now here in Florida to where you have to go and get a court order just to review body cam footage. That wasn't the intent of it, but they went back and changed it with little or no public input, and they changed it to now, like, if an officer do something, you have to go and basically get a court order just to view the body cam footage.
Yeah,
that's not transparency either.
It's the wrong direction, and that's what you see as a big backlash right now, where states are not moving in the right direction when it comes to policing. In many ways, they're moving backwards, especially in the South. So you see, Florida, Texas is another example where they signed legislation saying if a city were to cut their police budget, the state could just go and overrule that decision. And Florida signed a similar law. So you have this now across the South, really across more conservative states. You have a backlash against any type of reform. But again, when we look at the numbers, I mean, things are not getting better. It's not like the problem is solved and we can, we've gone too far in one direction. We need to go back in the other direction. If anything, like, we haven't even scratched the surface in terms of actually starting to hold the police accountable. And now they're trying to dismantle what little progress has been made. So, again, I think it's something we need to be mindful of, vigilant, and fighting back. Particularly in Florida, where it seems to be that the state legislature is moving in the wrong direction.
And also, Samuel, and I got a few more questions, and then we can wrap it up. When the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act came, did any of these politicians try, being that, and I'm quite sure everyone know of you, did anyone ever try to come and like get you to craft anything that you were saying a lot of things are missing from a lot of these federal databases? Did anyone ever reach out to you as far as trying to help craft up language for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act? And if it's that weak, if it's weak, if it's weak as some people say it is, then what good is it to have?
Yeah, so the answer to that is yes. So I did inform some of the language in the Justice and Policing Act, in particular around like data collection. I think one of the big challenges and problems with the Justice and Policing Act is that it is, one, it's extremely limited in what it would do, partially because it's federal, and policing is just not federal, and it's very little of it is federally controlled. So the only real tools that the federal government has, one, they have a lot of jurisdiction over what types of military weapons police receive. So that's one thing that the federal government plays a big role in. The Justice and Policing Act curtails some of the most egregious types of military weapons, but going to police departments, but not everything. So I think there's still, police departments will still be able to get like AR-15s and like a whole bunch of other stuff, just not like the tanks. So I think it probably doesn't go far enough there. But the other piece of it is that so much of this is dependent on what local police departments choose to do and how they choose to relate with the federal government. So even under the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, the federal government can say, and the DOJ would be able to say, we would not, our federal funding to local police departments will be conditional on those departments adopting certain policies and standards and accountability measures. Otherwise, we're not going to fund those departments. But ultimately, federal funding accounts for a tiny fraction of those police departments' budgets. It's usually like 1, 2, 3, or 4%, and most departments don't even get any money from the federal government like that. So it's just not going to be a powerful enough tool to wholesale change all of these different police practices at once, because it's just not, the money is not that substantial to the agencies. If they cut it, it's not going to make that big of a difference. And even if they do make it conditional on the adoption, the enforcement of that is also going to be a little bit lax. So I think in general, there's a lot more that needs to happen, but I think the state level and the local level are really the biggest levers of power to address policing and criminal justice. But that being said, that doesn't mean it shouldn't pass. It should pass. It does have some good things in it. But ultimately we can't wait on that. We've been waiting for a long time for anything federally to happen. We'll probably still be waiting for a while. And in the meantime, the states are just killing us. What you talked about in Florida, what's happening in Texas, what's happening in Tennessee. A lot of places now are really adopting policies that are really, really substantially bad in impacting policing in our states.
And let me ask you too. Also, Samuel, do you collect any data on mass surveillance by police agencies?
Not at this time, but I know that there are some organizations that do that. There's like Stop LAPD Spying that does a lot around different surveillance technologies that are being used. So it's definitely an important part of the work, but my work is just focused on more of the police use of force outcomes.
And do you train people? I know you say you're branching out, or are you branching out to train people how to collect data, across the United States on police violence, and how to interpret and evaluate the data?
Absolutely. So I have a team now. We have 5 people on the team. We're expanding, and happy to work with anybody who wants to get involved in this work. You can reach out to me directly, SAMSWEY, the number 1, at gmail.com. I'm happy to recruit you, get you involved in the data collection work, train you on how to do it. If you want to do analysis or data visualization work, certainly can work with you on that as well. So yeah, we're a growing organization, and now we're starting to track data on non-fatal police shootings also, which there are just as many non-fatal police shootings as fatal police shootings. So we're expanding as well, and can certainly use some additional help.
Are you on social media? If you are, could you let the viewers know where you are on social media?
Twitter, IG,
So
anything.
I'm on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @Samswey, SAMSWEY. Feel free to reach out to me. My DMs are open and happy to work with anybody who wants to get involved in this work.
Okay, no Instagram, no Snapchat.
I mean,
Facebook?
I do have an Instagram. I haven't been on it in like a year. It's also at Samsway. And then the website for our project is mappingpoliceviolence.us, mapping police violence database. And then we also have a project that's focused on a range of other aspects of police data called the Police Scorecard at policescorecard.org. So there you can get information on misconduct complaints and police budgets and things like that.
Great.
So reach out. Happy to work with you.
Awesome. Outstanding. That's Samuel Sinyangwe. He's with Mapping Police Violence, the police violence organization. I want to thank you for stopping by the Adams Brothers podcast. That you've shared a ton of information with us, and keep on tracking the police and keep on holding them accountable.
You do an excellent job.
You're doing an excellent job.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And we thank you for coming on the Adams Brothers podcast. Absolutely. We're trying to make a difference here. We're trying to do our part too. So we appreciate you for coming on, and you have a great evening, Samuel. Thank you.
You too.
Have a good evening.